But we'll start at the ground zero is that, medical cannabis has always been illegal, as far as we know, for the past 80 odd years. The United Nations drug conventions and treaties that our governments always quote came about, and basically cannabis got outlawed. And in Australia and the allied countries, they went one step further to outlaw even hemp. They called it all marijuana, cannabis, hooch, whatever. But at the same time, most of the world, India, Turkey, all the countries behind the Russian curtain, Russia, Ukraine, Romania, they never stopped growing hemp. They just never stopped, because I should just point out that the UN Drug Convention has a special article in there that says that these drug conventions do not apply to industrial hemp grown for seed or fibre. So that's kind of our ground zero, and everyone's ground zero. In Australia and the allied countries, we went one step further by outlawing everything. But the UN drug conventions did allow for cocaine to be used for medicine. It's a very important drug for medicine. All eyes, nose, throat operations couldn't be done without a drug like coca that will dilate small blood vessels so people don't bleed to death as a local anaesthetic. And also, it's as though Coca-Cola was sitting in the room back in the 20s and 30s there, but where they talk about cocaine for medical purposes, they also talk about a soft drink syrup. And so that's how Coca-Cola gets a decoconised extract of coca that is used. Now, and it's important to know that all the legal cocaine in the world is grown in Colombia. And we also have America spending most of their drug enforcement money in Colombia. They even have Plan Colombia, but it's really all about protecting those 400 licensed farmers that grow all the world's legal cocaine for medical purposes and for a soft drink syrup. Opium was a bit different. They gave that to 8 companies. And those 8 companies basically had a monopoly on world pain management. They've cannibalised each other, and we're down to about 3 companies now. Those 3 companies, well, 2 of those 3 companies grow half the world's opium here in Australia. So in that UN drug convention that all the governments around the world signed up to, we're actually one of the few countries that are making money on it, because that same drug convention allows the Australian government to allow 2 foreign companies to contract our farmers here to grow their seed to produce the opium that they make their proprietary medicines from. With cannabis, it gets a bit sketchy, I suppose. There's not much information there, but when you try and have a look right to the very root of medical cannabis, as far as the UN is concerned, it basically lumps it in with opium, the same rules. A country can use opium and for medical purposes. But what it comes down to is that as long as that opium, the seed, or in this case cannabis, as long as that seed is from a lawful source, and there we have our problem. The lawful source, as far as cannabis has been concerned, has really been just one company in Monsanto. They've owned it for about 70 or 80 years. At the end of last year, Bayer bought Monsanto, so Bayer owns the only lawful source of cannabis really in the world. And from those products, from that cannabis, we have Sativex and we have Epidiolex. These are the 2 main products that not only the Australian government, but governments all around the world are parading in front of people when the medical cannabis debate does come up. Well, we've got Sativex, the spray from England, and we've got the Epidiolex, which is the paediatric epilepsy trial drug that is based in the US, by the way. And so you'll probably hear, you won't hear it said like this, but what our government here is saying, and a lot of other governments around the world, is that we're going to make medical cannabis legal by getting 40 or so kids onto an Epidiolex trial, paediatric epilepsy trial, which is based in the US. And what else are they doing? They're talking about the clinical trials they're doing with the spray, the Sativex, with chemo patients or people going through chemo. I should just point out that these are both not very good cannabis drugs. In fact, it's not the medical cannabis that's going on around the country and around the world. We have to really differentiate between what medical cannabis is and what governments are allowing. The governments are allowing pharmaceuticalised cannabinoid medicines. They're really the only products that can get approved and go through the TGA process so that a doctor can prescribe them. Medical cannabis is what's going on around the world. Basically, it really just means an exemption to smoke cannabis for medical purposes. And I'll just put that into perspective for you. So it started off in 1996 in the US, in California, where in the US, under their constitution, the states have access to citizens-initiated referendums. That's where the citizens of a state can get a petition up, and when they have sufficient numbers at the next federal or midterm election, they can actually have a question put on the ballot. What's important to know is that where this has happened from California in 96 right up to California again in last year, and all those states in between, that all those state governments ran no campaigns. But when the people voted, they voted it in. So in effect, what happened, the government was bypassed for its approval, and so was the Medical Association. But what it translated to was basically most all doctors in those states do not prescribe cannabis, but there is a handful, and especially ones associated to these dispensaries, where you go in and you pay $150. The doctor come up on Skype and you tell him your ailment, and he'll give you that exemption to smoke cannabis and to buy from this dispensary. In Canada, the Canadian Constitution contains a Bill of Rights, or a Charter of Rights, which gives the people in the country, the citizens, some power over the government. What happened in 2002, well, the culmination of a series of court cases in 2002 came about that the High Court of Canada found in favour of two defendants that they should be able to use cannabis for medical purposes. What the Charter of Rights gives the power to the High Court to, and they ordered the government to introduce a medical cannabis regime. And they had to do that. They were told to do it in a year. They took 2 years. But again, what's important to note, that the government didn't want it to happen, and nor did the medical profession. But because of the Constitution, they were forced to do it. So when you understand that, and then of course you have to understand that even in those US states and in Canada, there has been no products produced, no products clinically trialled that are prescribable. That is not happening. And by and large, and I can say this for Israel too, by and large, the medical profession have not adopted medical cannabis. In Israel, I don't know if people saw the special not long back, the Life of Its Own by Helen Capellos, Australian-based documentary on medical cannabis. But what was very interesting, that they went to Israel and they did interview the godfather of modern medical cannabis, Raphael Mechoulam, who has done a lot of medical cannabis research. But what was really interesting was that he does say that all of his research has been done only via DEA approval, and that every year he has to supply the research that he's going to do to the DEA. And again, in Israel, 30 odd years of research, 27,000 something patients, the medical profession hasn't adopted it, and by and large, there is still no products that have been produced and prescribable in Israel. So we have that real issue there, but it comes down to the same problem that every other country has, the lawful source. I suppose there's another couple of thoughts to really sink into your head so you can understand the situation. Governments don't own cannabis, just as they don't own opium and they don't own coca. Companies do. And in the case of cannabis, it's only a very tiny number of companies. And then even those companies, all of those companies aren't recognised internationally. So at the moment you're seeing some real limbo dancing by our federal government and the Canadian federal government to give these one or whatever companies some international legitimacy to allow some import over to here. And even the products that they're contemplating bringing over are really low dose. They're not, the traditional medical cannabis that's being used out there. It is still a pharmaceutical or cannabinoid medicine that hasn't been approved, hasn't, been gone through, TGA and other processes. So, but what all that comes down to is still the international stuff. The stuff we're hearing from our governments and politicians is really only to appease voters, and it's mostly in response to some pretty, heart-wrenching media reports that are coming through from people who are using cannabis, and patients and children, parents who are giving it to children, and we're seeing these miracles in terms of not being able, this won't happen with pharmaceutical drugs. So politicians and what they're saying is really in response to that. The rest of the world thinks that Australia has legal medical cannabis now because they've read the headlines. You know, but we read the same about Germany, Spain, Portugal, and other places. The truth is it's not happening. So ultimately, after taking all of that into consideration, we thought, well, how do we do it? How would a federal government use its own autonomy to try and push this along? So being bound by those UN drug conventions, and the added sweetener for us is that we make money, about $300 million from these two foreign companies who grow all their opium here, or half the world's opium here. We thought of interim measures, and we broke that down to coming up with options which reflect what's going on now. At the moment, with the new legislation the government has introduced, and lots of good press, they're inviting lots of companies and people to do this, and they're issuing licenses and that. We're still looking at about a 10, 15-year time frame before a product is actually approved, gone through TGA, and able to be prescribed by a doctor. So there's a few options that sort of talk about that. One of the options is also in that first lot is for even the government to allow Australian companies an amnesty, something like what happened in Canada. An amnesty where an Australian company that's ready to go, that is capable and has the partnerships available to it to produce a medicine, that short amnesty to access cannabis seed, source material from the black market. It can be a day or a week or whatever, but it's shut off, and that's more than enough time for a company to start going. But then we get into the real interim measures, is where Australia's going to have to devise a plan, a strategy, and protocols, and a whole process and regulatory system that will address those needs and concerns of those people who are using cannabis now. And when I talk about an interim measures plan, this is something that I'm presuming our government will have to take to the United Nations and say, look, we've changed all the laws, the legislative environment is absolutely perfect for companies to come and do this, it's going to take a long time, we'd like to introduce this and this as interim measures for the next 10, 15, 20 years until there is prescribable medical cannabis products on the market. And within those options, thank you. Just have a drink. So within those options, first and foremost, is that we really have to look at who's going to grow it, or first of all, who are the patient groups. This is the sort of thing that, although we've come up with this plan, there was no use us putting too much detail behind it, because there really is a lot of detail, and any flinching by government could derail a whole plan. But what we have asked is for advisory groups to be put together around all these issues, so we do come up with a plan, not a half-baked one, not one that we've just thought up, but one that is not only the process was approved by the government to develop these interim measures, but they're there to advise and give us the best options in the different scenarios. So the interim measures, the first of all would be, the patient groups, what kind of conditions, and obviously that will be an expanding list. And then, who's going to grow it, where they're going to grow it, how's it going to be regulated, kept clean, who's going to enforce make sure that people aren't using chemicals and herbicides and pesticides, and that kind of thing, and heavy nutrients and other things and heavy metals that make their way into the cannabis plant via nutrients that they're provided, and even the style in which cannabis will be grown for medical purposes. I think it's fair to say that medical cannabis, in that respect, will be an indoor grown thing. I can't see it being so much as an outdoor. Maybe if it's outdoor, it'll still be in a greenhouse or something like that. But I think cleanliness-wise and for surety and hygiene, I think it will be indoor grown. But then it's also, how do we process it? Who's going to process it? What kind of dosages are we looking at? And then, of course, there's the doctors. The doctors have no idea about medical cannabis, nor are they required to. In fact, they could get into trouble for talking about medical cannabis to a patient. The example is, if that patient goes away and uses cannabis, something happens, the doctor is liable, and their insurance will drop them like a hot potato. And this is happening around the world. This is predominantly why the medical professions in Israel, in the US and in Canada aren't wholeheartedly behind medical cannabis, because they'd be liable. These are products that aren't registered, they're not prescribable, it's not the things that they deal with. They can prescribe you anything that they like, which is, you know, a registered product. If something happens to you, generally the doctor is covered. He's done what he's required, he's prescribed this drug that's been approved, you got sick, it wasn't his fault. With cannabis, that's not going to be the case. So, getting back to the interim measures and why we really need to do that, it's now, you know, then there's doctors' education. You know, how much of whatever product that's developed, how much would the doctor be prescribing to that patient? Is it, you know, a few drops of whatever oil a day, a week, or, you know, morning and night, and at what strength? So we really have to sort those things out. And then, so there is quite a lot that we have to, and then there'd be data collection. Part of the interim measures and the promise made to the United Nations would be that we will collect all this information, collate it and extract and, you know, study it forensically to see patterns and use and, you know, strengths and dosage and titration and what conditions. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. Now, I say that, but I always say for a lot of situations with medical cannabis, well, why hasn't any other country done it? And it does sound simple. Well, why has it? And that's true. No country really has done it. It's getting back to that same story. No government in the world has willingly introduced a meaningful medical cannabis regime. So over the next, I don't know, till the next federal election, we've talked about this extensively with the Labor Party down in Canberra. In fact, they even, the Shadow Health Minister, Catherine King, in a news report said that they had written to the government to say you're taking too long and they should look at introducing interim measures. I think, you know, as a hemp party, we'll continue to push that, but at the same token, not really take the shine off the momentum and the social acceptability that we're experiencing now with medical cannabis use, and we're also, you know, this whole destigmatisation of cannabis. We'll be eating cannabis seed or hemp seed in our food shortly, and you know, by the end of the year or early next year, the government will have information and probably TV and radio ads talking about, hey, you know, hemp seed is great for you. There's no intoxication. It's just a really good food, and that's why we are allowing it. It is, you know, it's high in omega-3, 6 and 9, a perfect balance for human consumption. It's not animal-based omegas, these are plant-based omegas, which is just as good, if not better for you. All the range of amino acids and a broad range of vitamins and minerals. It's a really good seed. It tastes like nuts. It's versatile. You'll see it overseas. It's in Tetra Paks as a milk, non-dairy milk substitute in vanilla, chocolate and strawberry. We'll see all that. Salad dressings for the oil. We'll see it around. And this is all going towards these cannabis law reforms that we've been talking about. The interim measures is, you know, high on our agenda surrounding medical and pushing research and making sure that government do uphold the promises they've been making, that companies, organisations can come forward and do things. The interim measures plan, I mean, we get right back down to there's options which relate to, not-for-profit compassion clubs and dispensaries, you know, becoming part of that. If the pharmacies aren't going to want cannabis and cannabis products on their shelves next to all their registered products and that, we will have to find another way of distribution, just as they have in the US and Canada. You don't go to a pharmacy for your cannabis in those countries, you go to a dispensary or mail order, things like that. So these are the kinds of things that the hemp party is looking at. Hemp seed food will be pushing on that just as well. A lot of people have probably been seeing all through the country hemp seed products available on health food shop shelves. We just point out as an industry, I'm a hemp grower myself, this is all imported. In fact, one of the main companies in Australia, the most prominent one, whenever you do any kind of search on Google, this company comes up, and for all intents and purposes, you think it's an Australian grown hemp product, but it's not. It's all from China. And this company's repackaging, getting around our dodgy labelling laws, avoiding country of origin labelling and so forth. And they've not only been putting it in Australian packaging, selling it here, they've been exporting it to other countries, to Japan, to Korea. So we're already taking a bit of a hit in terms of our reputation. But these are the kinds of real unscrupulous entrepreneurs that will get in on any kind of things like that. I noticed that this same company sells a medical cannabis from industrial cannabis. So, I mean, look, I've read a lot about cannabis, and, you know, I often quote, you know, cannabis has been used for medical purposes for 5,000 years, but what I've never ever seen is anything in relation to medical cannabis being obtained from industrial hemp. In fact, we fought wars, you know, long ago. England did to the same wars we're fighting now over the future supply of oil. We had the same wars over the future supply of hemp. And there's a great book called Sir Joseph Banks and the Question of Hemp, which explains everything. It explains why Sir Joseph was this botanist on the Endeavour. He was actually on a war council. They were looking for an alternate source of hemp. But all that hemp back in them days was all, and for hundreds of years, was all coming from Russia and the Ukraine. And yeah, there was wars fought up there, you know, about the supply of that. And there's many references to that in several books, both even in America and in Australia. But that's just important to know. Hemp's on its way back now, so I think we'll see more and more of it. And then, of course, there's the social uses of cannabis, recreational or whatever. Australians love cannabis. Australians prefer cannabis over any other drug, and they really like it. And for, you know, if you have a look at statistically, they're very responsible cannabis users. Especially you cut out the reefer madness stuff, because we still haven't seen that happening. We've still had no deaths worldwide from the use of cannabis, but yet we're still in this situation where, if we go back to the original United Nations Drug Convention and this one company owning cannabis, it's like they've got every police force in the world making sure they don't get their product. And in essence, the United Nations Drug Convention does say you can use it for industrial purposes, for seed and fibre. It says, yes, you can use it for medical purposes, but what it does say, it can't be used for recreational purposes. And that seems to be the holy grail. And that's the one where, yeah, somehow this company has under its employ every police force in the world, for, you know, and governments who won't change laws, who won't regulate it, who won't tax it. In Australia, there's a great research. I mean, there's lots of research, but people, you know, have been paid money. There, a great reference material is a guy called Clements from Curtin University, who put the figure at $5 billion. That's how much Australians spend, $5 billion a year. Probably a lot more now. It's an older report. $5 billion a year just on cannabis. It's all untaxed, unregulated. It's twice the size of the Australian wine industry. And, you know, you've got to be thinking, like, that's just here. This is happening around the world. You know, I always like to go back to prohibition of alcohol. Obviously, we're all too young to have experienced alcohol prohibition in the US, but we certainly heard about the stories. We heard about Al Capone. We heard about the corruption, where the corruption was just so blatant in every city, every town, every mayor, every police force was just caught up in this. And just the unintended negative consequences. You couldn't get a beer, you couldn't get a low alcohol beer or wine or a civilised scotch, but you could get moonshine down every alley. And the corruption was just so blatant, but you still had police on the sidelines saying, you know, going to their monthly budget meetings or yearly budgets meetings saying, give us more money and we'll be able to eradicate this alcohol, because that's what the law says. We're in the same situation now. There's blatant corruption in front of our eyes around cannabis now, which people just don't even see, and they refuse to see and refuse to look at. It's a scary thing to look at, you know, and delve into and find out things. And then, of course, taking that to appropriate authorities where you can't trust those authorities. So this is happening now. Just imagine it. It's $5 billion, just one country, twice the size of the wine industry. It's all untaxed. We don't even know where all that money goes to. It's like moonshine. So Nimbin here, I mean, we're like Oxford Street before gay rights. When the media and people want to see gay, they went to Oxford Street. They changed the laws, turned out gay was all over the country. There was, those enforcement guys were gay one night, and then the next night they were going with their workmates and catching gays. We're in the same situation now. The media want to see pot, they come to Nimbin, because here it's open, that's it. But I can tell you, Nimbin is a drop in the bucket in terms of the Australian cannabis use situation. Here we're pretty proud that we can show it off, and we're a bit more open about it. Here, the only difference is you can smoke a joint in the street. No one's going to ring the cops. In the cities and so forth, for some reason, people get the urge to ring the police. Someone's smoking a joint, or I smelt cannabis smoke coming out of that house or whatever, or I saw a plant. That's just the only difference here. No one's going to dob anyone else on it. So, we think that when the tide does churn, especially with medical cannabis, what we have seen with our own eyes, Kathleen saw it and Michael saw it when they went to Canada and the US, you'll see the differentiation between hard and soft drugs. Recreational cannabis sort of jumps on the back of medical, and cannabis users are different from, they generally just do cannabis. They don't like other drugs, and most, by and large, don't even drink a lot of alcohol. So, these are these unintended positive consequences. That's just one. We'll see a reduction in domestic violence. We'll see less road fatalities. We'll see less drug overdoses. We'll see all these more positive unintended consequences that are, starting to come out of the US now. But because, again, the governments are actually against it, and federally, the US federal government has never ever adopted any medical cannabis regime or anything like that. In fact, officially, they still oppose what the states are doing, but they understand they can't do anything about it. So, I hope I haven't confused too many people. The situation's irrational, so I'm not trying to rationalise it for you. I'm just trying to give you some of the facts of what's going now, help you see between the lines of what politicians are talking about, and also give you an idea of where the hemp embassy is, what we've been thinking about, what we've been talking about, what we've been doing, and what we'll continue to do in the future on those three different topics: industrial and medical and recreational uses of cannabis. So I'm pretty keen to leave it at that, but I'm glad to answer any questions if anybody has any, and thank you all for coming. Yeah.
Hi Andy, I'm just wondering, there are about 9 companies I read now that have been given some sort of licence by the government,
Yeah.
Either for research or cultivation.
That's in Australia.
Yeah, in Australia. Where are they getting their seeds from? If you're saying one company, Monsanto, owns cannabis,
Yeah.
where are these guys going to get their seed from? From Monsanto or?
No, well, you've read those announcements, then you would have seen. I think 2 of them don't really make mention. The other couple make mention of having connections with Canadian companies, and I think 2 say that they're going to bring some in from Israel. We don't really know. We know the Victorian government did do a bit of a deal and bent lots of rules and bought a bit of seed in from Tilray, and a Canadian company. But these manoeuvres, that's what I was explaining. We're bending our rules. The governments over there are bending their rules. We're bending the international rules to give these Canadian companies some kind of international legitimacy. Israel's still not allowed. Their ministry still won't allow any export. The Netherlands, well, you've just got Bedrocan really there. So when we talk about these other countries, we're not talking about their governments. We're not talking about, the Canadian government. We're talking about our government or companies here talking to other companies in Canada. So everyone's just trying to get rules bent for them and so forth. That's, I hope that explains it for you. But no, the only Monsanto's out of the game now, it's Bayer. They're already here. They already have Epidiolex, and the government quite openly backing getting children onto that trial and spending a lot of money for what is a very cheap drug. And Sativex, that's GW, but Bayer again. So they're the 2 that are here. Their products, more or less pharmaceuticalised cannabinoid medicines, rather than, these Canadian companies, whether they're going to bring in seed or their products which are unregistered, never been clinically trialled. There's going to be a lot of rules bent. I can't rationalise why they do that. Yeah. But if it does take off, all good and well, and I hope Australian companies do, obtain their own lawful source and not have to rely on our government giving another company legitimacy, and then they will own whatever's grown here, whatever an Australian company, gives them the foot in the door. That Canadian company will own whatever comes from that. Yeah. I hope that puts it a bit more in perspective. Yeah. Yes. Hello there.
Are you aware of Hippocrates' view on cannabis in medicine?
No, not at all.
I understand when you say that our government and the industry needs to do a lot of data collection to turn the tide here. But what I don't understand is, as an example, a state like Colorado,
Yep.
who have it up and running, why can't we mirror what's being done there?
The Colorado government opposed what's happening there. It was only that the people were able to initiate a referendum. We don't have that in our constitution. The Colorado government didn't need the approval of the Colorado government. They in fact opposed it, and nor did they need, well, more recently we're talking about recreational. That's more recently occurred in Colorado, and that's made the big splash.
And yet, and look, this is probably a question you can't answer, but statistically, that state has reaped tens and tens of millions
that's
of dollars
one of
in
those
taxes
statistics, absolutely.
that would fix roads and hospitals.
Yeah, but I'll tell you another bit. The Californian government, or the Californian electorate at the last state and at the last federal election, they also adopted regulated recreational cannabis. The government there not only opposed it, they don't want any money. The Californian government won't be making that reaping of money going into education, health, and that sector. In fact, all that money will go to a marijuana control board, which will oversee, all these, recreational coffee shops or whatever they're going to call them. But also they will use that money to enforce they'll create another black market. If you grow more than 6 plants, you're going to be in trouble. If you sell cannabis, you're going to be in trouble. And that money will be used to enforce that. Yeah.
And look, I don't want to completely take it over, but you may be able to answer this question. How do we have a state here of South Australia where you can grow so many plants, 6 plants, 4 plants, whatever, but in other states we can't?
Yeah.
How does that work?
Well, you're not actually allowed to. It's just decriminalised. South Australia started out with a 10-plant limit a while ago, and by default, because the other states didn't go that way, they became the default supply state. It took a while for that to really take off, but they've lowered their numbers since then. But no, you're not allowed to. The police can still come. They'll take your cannabis. They can still take you to court. They could give you a fine. It's just decriminalised. There's an opportunity there to not get a criminal record against you. Yeah. Yeah, and same here in New South Wales. You're not allowed to have 14 grams on you, but if you haven't got a drug record, and if you get caught with police, they can give you a caution. It's just It's worse than prohibition of alcohol. They're actually making safe customers for the black market. It's that dumb. Yeah. Any other questions?
Hi, Andrew.
Hi.
One last question, I guess. Just regard to the importing of medical cannabis preparations now. Is that a guideline by the government by setting these, by having these solutions that they're saying can be imported?
Well, they're responding to pressure by individuals and high-profile advocates. So these products that are coming in. What I do know is you can't just go to one of these licensed producers in Canada and have a choice of their entire range of buds and so forth. I think the most that's come in, what I'm aware of, is a 1-to-1. Sativex is a 1-to-1. That's where we, 27 milligrams delta 9 to 25 milligrams of CBD. It's in no way is that a common 1-to-1 or a ratio you'd see in recreational cannabis or the cannabis that's used for medical purposes. This is a manufactured cannabinoid medicine. And I'm also hearing even the products coming from Canada is around that scale as well. We're not looking at high THC cannabis or anything. We're caught up with the CBD thing, which are not in any way, shape or form like medical cannabis that's being used by and large by millions of people in these states in the US and Canada. So, again, the government's trying to find soft options to, tell people that they are doing something about it. Hope that helped. Yep.
Yeah, I was going to say, we'll wind it up now, Andrew. Thank you
very much. Hope everyone has a great weekend.